Welcome to our next discipleship class. So, we're in part 3 of Atheism and Ethics. We were moving through and quoting from the atheist.org website and then answering some of the questions regarding things they put out from a Christian perspective. So, here we have landed with the concept that they bring out of imprinting. And this is something they believe is developed through natural selection, evolution. So the atheists claim, to quote them, because our nervous systems are imprintable, we are able not only to fall in love at first sight, we are able to love objects and ideals as well as people, and we are able to love with variable intensities. So, interestingly enough, the definition really of what that is, in case you don't know, excuse me, imprinting is a particular kind of learning characterized by occurrence in very early life, rapidity of acquisition, and relative insusceptibility to forgetting or extinction. Imprinted behavior includes most or all behavior commonly called instinctive, but imprinting is used purely descriptively. Remember, you're just describing what is seen. When you're looking at something descriptively, that is not necessarily telling you why it is. Now, certainly going from biological evolution to things that are ideals and non-physical things and ideas and concepts is something that's really contrary to the evolutionary process. So instinct transcends biology. In other words, it's not just the chemicals in your brain banging into each other that is creating instinct. Instinct is beyond that. It transcends it. Now, it will certainly use that, but it's something other than just the molecules doing their work. Descriptively, observing behavior is not morality, it is sociology. If we're watching something happen, if we watch children learn instinctively from their parents certain things, concepts and ideas, that is something that is sociology. That's not morality. You can learn a lot of things by watching, and even animals will pick up certain things, but animals are not picking up the whole concept of love, values, and all that other stuff. So to all of a sudden develop that and assume that that's just something that takes place from biology is really a leap. So imprinting is limited, and morality, because we're dealing with the issue of ethics that they have brought up, morality transcends humanity. In other words, it comes from God, because everybody has a sense of moral obligation. Everyone has a conscience, and conscience is not made of chemicals. If it was, how much does justice weigh? And which one is the moral molecule? In other words, you can't find that in your brain. It's just not part of the chemical structure. Conscience isn't created by us. Man doesn't create conscience. It transcends humanity. Our guilt or sense of wrong does not come from us. Now, we sense it, but it really is something that God has put in us, and that's why it transcends us. Everybody has it. If everybody just made their own conscience and sense of right and wrong, then not only would they be all different and everybody would be at odds, but it wouldn't be something that everybody would, I wouldn't have a conscience that bothered me. I wouldn't have guilt. Why would I have guilt? I mean, if a lion, takes down a wildebeest, he's not feeling bad about it. That's lunch. So we need to really put things into the proper category to understand them. Everybody senses right and wrong. No one is free of guilt. and no one has a silent conscience. Interestingly enough, in Romans 2, the Bible talks about conscience, and Paul the Apostle said that our conscience either accuses us or excuses us before God, because God is the one that puts that within us, and that's the basis of being judged apart from any law. It's by conscience. Number 3, atheists have morality. I mean, just because a person's an atheist doesn't mean that they're immoral. I think that would be, that's also not true. They typically agree we shouldn't harm others. I don't think that you have somebody, because they decide that they don't want to believe in God or don't believe that God exists or whatever, that all of a sudden they're going to go out and harm people. We talked about that earlier. Now, they may have a sense where they actually may feel as though they don't have the same moral obligations as a Christian, but that doesn't mean that they're automatically going to go out and do something wrong. They typically agree that we shouldn't hurt others. I think it would be ridiculous to say that they assume they should. Why? Because their conscience dictates a similar morality to those who do believe in God. Because whether a person, it doesn't matter how a person believes, they're still created in God's image, and God gives them that conscience. What does it mean if atheists disagree? Now, if an atheist disagrees with me as a Christian, in other words, they may agree with me morally, saying that it's not right to hurt others, but they may call it a preference. They may be honest and say, well, look, that's, if we're not going to deal with morality and ethics as an absolute, then I take it as a personal preference. And they may do that. But it means that they have the same desire for morality but can't intellectually justify it. In other words, if an atheist is honest within their worldview, there is no objective moral absolutes. If there's no objective moral absolutes, then if they choose to do something that we would consider morally justifiable, then they would say, that's fine, it's my choice or my preference to do that, and that's just for me. However, though they can't reference to some objective standard outside of humanity, they also, though they may desire similar things as everybody else that believes in God, they cannot intellectually justify their position for morality. But they want the same morality because their conscience is given to them by the same God. They want it emotionally, but they disagree with it intellectually. In other words, atheists tend to argue, as we talked about epistemologically, they have the same sense of, in a lot of areas, of moral right and wrong and all that. And emotionally, they feel that these things are right, these things are wrong, that for the most part, we would probably all agree with. However, they just disagree with the intellectual reason for it, which is really what we're dealing with here ethically. So this is a system of self-contradiction. In other words, it's unreasonable to want something and then try to say that it's morality when it can't be objective, and also at the same time to have no basis for justifying something right or wrong objectively other than my own preferences. So this is where we find that there's a contradiction within atheism. Number 5, morality is not relative to culture. A lot of times atheists will argue that, well, if a culture believes something's right, then it's right. Now, obviously, we're back to sociology again. And also, this is what Nazi Germany did. They exampled this for the world. Genocide, however, is not a fashionable preference. It is wrong. And nobody would agree with it. Now, the Nazis may have agreed with it because they were doing it, but obviously that was the twisted view of Hitler and what he was doing, as well as many of the other leaders like Lenin and Stalin and Pol Pot and them that killed really millions of their own people. But that does not, just because they have the power to do it, and because even if you could get 51% of the votes saying it's okay to do, that does not make it a morally right thing to do. Because what you're watching descriptively is sociology. That's all it is. It's not morality. Morality is prescriptive. It's what we ought to do, not what we do. It's what we have an oughtness to do, not what we just end up doing. And there's no way really to justify that kind of behavior and then say, well, that's just them doing it and that's what they prefer, because morality is not relative to people. You can't isolate it to just some aspects, some cultures, or some, at a certain geography, the morality changes when you cross borders. It doesn't work like that. The truth does not change crossing a border. Something is either right or wrong. It doesn't become right and wrong depending upon what side of the border you're on. Now, what's okay for you is not necessarily okay for me. That's why relativism cannot be true. You can say, well, that's true for you, but not for me. But that's not true for me. In other words, that's not true for everybody, so you can't make that claim. You cannot make a claim for me. You can't say that's true for me, but not for you, because it's not. This is the problem with that. Now, the absolute nature of truth contradicts this. Truth is absolute. It is easy to establish. The truth is not tricky. The truth is not hard to understand. The truth corresponds to the facts or corresponds to reality. Now, we talked about this earlier. There are 3 innate concepts of understanding that we're all born with, we all understand. We talked about the law of identity. I know this is this because of my ability to identify it as such. I know I'm me and you're not me, okay? And then there's the law of excluded middle. I'm not partway me. I'm either me or I'm not me. You're either you or you're not you. You're not partly you, okay? And then at the same time, the law of non-contradiction. You can't have two things that are opposite and true at the same time in the same sense. So the truth is absolute in that sense. Now, and everybody agrees on that, because to try to disagree with it, you're using the law of non-contradiction and you're using the correspondence view of the truth to try to deny it. To try to deny the truth is absolute, you need to use the framework, what I'm talking about, of absolute truth logically and non-contradiction in order to deny it. So in trying to deny it, you're actually affirming it. Now, if the truth is absolute, then I know that what is opposite the truth is not true. It's false. And that's where we get to this whole understanding of theistic God. Because if the truth is absolute, if we're dealing with the law of identity, excluded middle, non-contradiction, then you can't have multiple gods, because that violates the simple laws of logic. And plus, you have gods that are not infinite, because they all lack in something. Otherwise, there would not be more than one. You cannot have any aspect of a non-infinite God, any aspect of finite, changing God, developing God. God is everything. God is me. God is you. All that flies in the face of everything that we know, how we're constructed to think, and what makes logical sense to anybody. Now, you can deny it. People can believe anything if they want. However, everything can't be true. And so when we work it from that perspective, and we look at the fact that what we have in creation is the effect. The cause has to be greater. The cause has to be beyond time, space, material. It has to be intentional. There has to be intelligence. There has to be purpose. Non-contingent. We went through the list of that because that's really the only thing that the Creator can be, and that's who we call God. That's who the Bible calls God. So the absolute nature of truth contradicts any morality relative to people, and the law of non-contradiction prevents morality from being relative. To say that the truth is relative or morality is relative, you're making an absolute statement to say that you have no absolutes. That's the problem with it. So, the moral implications of atheism. This is from Frank Turek's book, Stealing from God, which I would highly recommend, by the way. He said, if you follow Darwinian principles consistently, you get the kind of moral outworking that James Rachels suggests. Rachels is the author of Created from Animals, The Moral Implications of Darwinism. He defends the Darwinian view that the human species has no more inherent value than any other species. Speaking of the mentally handicapped, Rachels writes, quote, what are we to say about them? The natural conclusion, according to the doctrine we are considering, in other words, Darwinism, would be that their status is that of mere animals, and perhaps we should go on to conclude that they may be used as non-human animals are used, perhaps as laboratory subjects or as food. This is the logical implication of atheism, because though all atheists would not see things like this, their system of their worldview, their system of belief, it puts them in a place where there is no moral accountability because nobody is there to be accountable to, number one. And number two, the only other place that we can come from is looking down from animals. And what would be the difference? If we're just developed animals, then there is no real value or morality. It's just no different than the animal kingdom, that which we see operating, on the Discovery Channel. All right, moving along. So, natural selection, a response to that, because that is part of what they bring up. Natural selection is viewed as having made this imprinting concept. So, number one, natural selection cannot account for design. We need to understand that before we move forward. Most atheists, can't talk today, are evolutionists and rely on natural selection to solve problems beyond its capability. In other words, they're giving it much more credit than it deserves. Design in biological systems requires a designer. It's not an accident. Evolution has no means of design, since it is a blind process of matter acting on matter over long periods of time. Time adds nothing to development. Actually, time works it the other way. The law of entropy allows things to fall to a less ordered state. The energy is used up. I mean, it's the rust on the car. It's why you got to get another car. If you have it long enough, the body will rust out on it, because that's what happens. It's not developing. Making natural selection the hero of all forms of development beyond biological systems result in an atheist miracle worker. You can't just say natural selection did it. Atheists claim that people are using God of the gaps argument, which we don't if we do it properly. We're not just saying God did it. We're arguing to the best explanation. This is what we use based on what we know. The inference to the best explanation is what we offer for reasonable answers to what reality is and what it's all about. Now, if I just keep saying, how did I get this ability to do logic, understand the universe, do you know, discover the mathematical computations that describe how orderly the universe is and nature's goal directed and cause and effect and all this. It's like, let's slow down on what we're giving natural selection some credit for here, because what we're doing is we're using the natural selection of the gaps. Okay, we're giving natural selection all this incredible power and capability when all it does is it, if the information is in the DNA of a species, then it may survive some environmental factors. We're not going too much beyond that. We're dealing with modifications within a species. That's what we would technically call microevolution. Macroevolution is one species to the next, which requires tremendous development, design, and function, which natural selection does not provide. Why do the most vocal atheistic evolutionists deny design? Why do they do this? Because they would have to admit a designer, which they reject a priority without any evidence. Evolutionists reject a designer and therefore design. They back into it. This is Francis Crick in What a Mad Pursuit. He said biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed but rather evolved. I mean, look, if I have to keep reminding myself that I can't trust my own senses, well, why am I trusting my senses listening to Francis Crick? Well, how do I know his senses are any better than mine? Why do I have to keep telling myself, wow, there's tremendous design in that? Wow, no, you can't, don't call that design. You know, do whatever you want, but do not call it design, because then we'll have to have a designer. How about Richard Dawkins in The Blind Watchmaker on page 1? He didn't even really get into the book before he said, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Yeah, they certainly look like that. Boy, that car had all those pieces. They looked like they were really designed and put together to work. But, you know, it's pretty complicated and everything. But, you know, that motor that was developed by Henry Ford, yeah, that internal combustion thing, that happened all on its own. I don't think so. I think that we can trust our own senses and our own reasoning when we look at these things. Again, Dawkins said, the universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. Well, the last quote could probably be said of Dawkins' books. No design, no purpose, nothing but pitiless indifference. In that case, why should anybody read them? I mean, think about this. If I'm saying to you, I want you to view everything else in a particular way, I don't want you to view my writings like that, I'll tell you how you're supposed to think. Well, that's a little insulting. I mean, if I need Richard Dawkins to explain to me how I need to view the world so that I can view it correctly, then that means I'm kind of making Richard Dawkins my God and saying, okay, Richard, whatever you say, that goes, and you are the one that'll give me the absolute truth. I don't think so. I think that's a very poor way to reason your way to what reality actually is. Now, there are two central arguments for evolution. The first is small adaptations lead to new species. In other words, micro to macro evolution. Microevolution, that's really nothing but variation within a species. It's not changing it from one thing to another. It's just the variation within that is normal, and we see it all the time. The second thing is similarities in structure, homology, and DNA are viewed as evidences of a common ancestor. So evolutionists look at the similarities in DNA, and then they say, okay, so there's similarities, and so that means that one came from the other, which I think is incorrect. But let's look at the first real central argument to evolution, which is small adaptations lead to new species. So these little modifications over long periods of time will jump into something else. The change attributed to natural selection is cyclical, not directional. We see this in Darwin's finches with their beaks, making the adjustment from larger to small beaks based on what was available for them to eat during the season. But this is not evolution. This is just variations within a species. You start with finches and end with finches, but the origin of finches is never explained. Survival is explained, not arrival. And again, this is the same way evolutionists argue for any kind of ethics or morals. They argue epistemologically based on what everybody knows, but they never ask the ontological question, why are there morals in the first place? Now, to try to jump and say that, well, natural selection gave them to us, that's a real stretch. There's nothing that connects there. Where did finches come from? Darwin had a view on survival of the species, but not on the arrival of the species, origins. Again, the same kind of concept of epistemology as opposed to ontology. Modifications within a species is not biological evolution. All right? Modifications within a species is really not what we're talking about when we're talking about evolution. We do call it microevolution, but it's really not. It's just modifications. So that's the first one. The second one is similarities in structure, homology, and DNA are evidences of a common ancestor. So, homology. Does similarity of structure prove a common ancestor? Well, no. Of course not. I mean, just because there are similarities does not mean that one thing came from another. Does similarity of structure prove that the pot evolved from the teaspoon? Well, obviously not. But, I mean, this is an oversimplified example, but it makes the case pretty clear. Now, Darwinist Tim Berra offered the progression of the Corvette as evidence of descent with modification. In other words, notice how the Corvette developed. But what's interesting is this is known as Berra's blunder because this is actually an illustration of intelligent design. It required intelligence and the modification of intelligence inputted to this design to make the Corvette better each time they come out with a new model. So this was actually helping the opposite. This was working against evolution, not for it. Darwinists say that we know all of Earth's creatures share a common ancestor by way of unguided macro, that's one thing to another, evolutionary processes because of DNA and homology. And how do we know that DNA and homology all point to a common ancestor rather than a common designer? The answer, because macroevolution is true. That's circular reasoning. So the question that Darwinists or evolutionists that believe in evolution, what their position is that, when you say, well, how do you know that DNA and homology point to a common ancestor rather than a common designer? They go, well, because macroevolution is true, which is circular reasoning. Let me show you how this works, all right? Because scientists don't say anything, scientists do. How does their thinking work? How do you know evolution's true? DNA and homology. You have a common ancestor, one thing from another. Why not common designer? Because evolution is true. And then you're back to how do you know evolution is true? This is circular reasoning. And unfortunately, this type of thinking that gets locked in like this, if you hear it over and over again, you just start to believe it as being true. So let's take a look here at something that Frank Turek has to say.
So there's irreducibly complex aspects to biology that seems to prevent a gradual, non-intelligent process that brings forth new body plans.
So do you believe that things such as evolution were set in place by this higher power?
I think there's a lot of problems with macroevolution. Now, when you use the word evolution, you need to define your term.
Darwinian.
Okay, if you mean change over time, everybody agrees with that. Christians, non-Christians. If you mean microevolution, adaptation within a type, everybody agrees with that. But if you mean macroevolution, molecules to man without intelligence, I not only think the evidence is not there for that, I think there's evidence against it. For example, the fossil record is one piece of evidence against it. The Cambrian explosion shows every major phyla come into existence without fossil precursors. Number two, there's genetic limits to change, which appear to prohibit this kind of macroevolutionary change. I mean, breeders can't break genetic limits to change. Why should we expect non-intelligent processes to do so? There's something now known as epigenetic information, which is the structure of a cell which you can't modify by mutations, which shows that you could modify or mutate DNA from now till doomsday. You'll never get a new body plan. Why? Because DNA alone won't give you a new body plan. You need epigenetic information. This is all from Stephen Meyer's book, Darwin's Doubt, if you want to go further. There's irreducible complexity, which shows that it's very difficult, or it seems virtually impossible, to create these new body plans in gradual ways, because you need all of the body plan and all the parts together in one place at one time to have function. For example, you can't have flight on a bird if you only have half a wing. You won't even get flight if you have 90% of a wing. You need 100% of a wing. So how do you get flight in a bird if you only have half a wing? You don't. The creature wouldn't live if it only had half of a wing. So there's irreducibly complex aspects to biology that seems to prevent a gradual, non-intelligent process that brings forth new body plans. And all this is in stealing from God, and if you really want to get the depth for it, you need to go to Darwin's Doubt, which is Stephen Meyer's hernia-inducing volume about this big.
All right. Now, the one thing that I would certainly add is obviously where he's talking about just a percentage of a wing. How about our the transport system for blood in our body? I mean, when you're dealing with your heart, your organs, the movement of blood. I mean, your heart's a pump that pumps blood. That all has to be put together at one time. That doesn't just gradually happen. You don't develop a heart to pump blood that doesn't exist, and you don't have blood that just doesn't move around or do anything. And these things are irreducibly complex, and irreducible complexity is one of the really major hurdles that Darwinists don't realize they have to overcome. Now, where is the evidence? We're talking about the fossil record, and evolutionists, Darwinists are always talking about that the fossil record answers all these questions for us. Not really. Darwin said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, he said, my theory would absolutely break down. This is page 334 of the 6th edition. So Darwin made it clear. Now, obviously, he thought eventually they would discover the evidence. He had that faith, right? But he didn't disband his theory. However, he didn't have the evidence for it and expected at some point it would occur. He went on to say, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links. Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory. So at the point that he wrote Origin of Species, he did not have the evidence actually for his theory. Now, Stephen Jay Gould, who used to be the paleontologist over at Harvard University in our backyard here, he says the fossil record does not support Darwinism. Now, he was a big evolutionist, so he said, the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. In other words, the evidence does not exist. In National Geographic, there was one of the series was Darwin wrong? It says, illuminating but spotty, the fossil record is like a film of evolution from which 99 out of every 1,000 frames have been lost on the cutting room floor. So that's in 2004. Now, again, because people are recognizing the fact that the fossil record does not answer what Darwinists need for it to answer for the theory to have any credence. Certainly to be reasonable, never mind scientific. What's the definition of spotty is right. What would the fossil record look like if creation were true? Well, first of all, this is what macroevolution looks like. You have this tree and everything develops off of the tree. It's all linked, right? This is the dream. Like Gould and Darwin also said that this doesn't actually exist. This is the dream. Now, the microevolutionary changes within a type, yes. On the left, as you can see, you have a modification of dogs, but they're all dogs. Now, the macroevolutionary changes between types on the right, no. That does not exist. The left does exist, the right does not. One is micro on the left, macro is on the right. This is the true picture. You just have the end nodes, right? Even like Gould said, that's all you really have. The rest, you're making it up. You're just dreaming about it. It's a story. You're filling in the gaps. You're surmising, but that's not science. That's speculation. There aren't missing links. There's a missing chain. Now, the fossil record can't establish ancestral relationships. 99% of the biology of any organism resides in its soft anatomy, which is inaccessible in a fossil. This is a quote from Michael Denton. And then the other quote, to take a line of fossils and claim that they represent a lineage is not a scientific hypothesis that can be tested, but an assertion that carries the same validity as a bedtime story, amusing, perhaps even instructive, but not scientific. And we need to understand that those things are true. Now, have you considered regarding change within organisms and environmental factors, the best evidence to date indicates that these factors are inadequate to drive full-scale microevolution. Something else is required, intelligence. This is from William Dembski's The Design Revolution. Great book, by the way. Have you considered? Now, this is interesting. Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge co-authored Punctuated Equilibrium in 1972, recognizing that there is no evidence of transitional forms in the fossil record. Therefore, they believe the absence of evidence means that species punctuated to the next level, leaving no trace. Conveniently, their evidence of evolution is no evidence. This is not science. This is storytelling pretending to be science. In other words, they realized that the fossil record did not represent what it needed to. And so they said, well, because we're going to hold to the theory of evolution and we see the end nodes, well, what must have happened, hence no evidence, hence storytelling, what must have happened is one species punctuated to the next, leaving no trace. That's not science. You can believe it if you want to, but that's not science. That's not reasonable. That's not logical. That's not evidentiary. There's no evidence to substantiate any of that. That's just somebody's dream world. That's not science, and I think that we need to recognize that. Now, jumping into the cosmological argument, I think that we'll actually wait till next time to go through this. I want to take a little bit of time with this. It won't be a long presentation next time, but we're breaking over 40 minutes, so just in case this extends a little beyond that, I think we'll wait till the next time. But until then, may God richly bless you as you continue to study His Word.